Do you know that more and more colleges now are starting to say you don't need American history to graduate? That just sends chills up my spine. I can't believe that, but it's true. In fact, I was looking up something the other day, getting ready for the class, and kind of ironic, there's a school back east called George Washington University. They have now, as of 2016, they got rid of American history as a requirement. Doesn't that irony just make your heart, it just makes my heart hurt. It's just, really. So they don't have to graduate. Now, they can take a lot of history courses. I mean, they still, if you want to major in it, you have to take some history, but you can take all these oddball histories and not general American history anymore. Do you know back in the 70s, I don't know what happened to it, but there was a textbook that was being looked at to decide whether they wanted to use them in the Texas school systems for kids. Do you know that somebody counted it up? They had 5 pages devoted to Marilyn Monroe and 4 lines devoted to George Washington. More space was devoted to McCarthy, the McCarthy hearings, than anything about America's famous founding fathers and things like that. So something's gone kind of crazy with this stuff here. So I thought maybe today we could take a look at the religious history, because we're starting to get. Sorry, you guys, am I in the way here? I can move over. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. So here's the modern secular view that we're starting to hear more and more. And so I picked 2 people, Bill Maher, Bill Maher, and Bob Woodward, as of the Woodward and Bernstein people. And so here's what Maher said: the Christian right happens to be hijacking this country. I don't think this is what the founding fathers had in mind. Really? Okay, we'll see how that turns out. Woodward: we have a minority religious group who wants to impose their religious values on a secular country that has separation of church and state. We're going to come back to the separation of church and state because that's been so badly misused over the years. So is that true that these founding fathers, and remember what we did the other week was we looked at the Pilgrims and Puritans. Now we're moving on to look at the founding father period, the 1700s. But I want to do just a real quick background as far as colonial America. So Jamestown, when it was founded, in their charter, it said, every plantation which our Heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted out. Jamestown, that's 1607, from the very first people that came here, that was in their charter. It's going to be heavenly oriented. We talked about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Wow, they were just strict Calvinists from the get-go, and we looked at their material the other week. And the other early colonies that started following, almost all of them mentioned God and Christianity in their charters. This is their formal setup as they start their colony, and God is in there. And by the 1770s, almost 100% of the people here in this land were Protestants, not just Christians, but Protestants. You had some Catholics, you had some other groups along the way, but a lot of them were Protestants.
So why do we still have God on our money?
What's that?
Why do we still have God on our money?
Why do we still have God on our money? I don't know. That's probably maybe the next thing that goes, huh? So let's look at the Constitution. The complaint, the critics will say, is that, well, the word God doesn't appear in there. It does in the Declaration of Independence, doesn't it? We're endowed by our Creator, but the word Creator doesn't pop up, and the word God doesn't pop up in the Constitution. But here's the deal. The Constitution that we see today, that's there in Washington under glass and all, that came from state constitutions. It wasn't out of thin air that this thing came about. It came from state constitutions. They were modeled after colonial era documents that they set up. And they were called covenants more so than constitutions. So you can hear that New Testament, Old Testament term. They saw them as a religious covenant that was put together. Washington, as they were beginning to meet and figure out how do we want to organize this country, how do we want to put our powers together, and who's going to be in authority and things like that, he took Thomas Hooker's Constitution. Hooker's a really famous Puritan preacher in the colonial time period. He wrote the first Constitution in America. It was a Puritan preacher who wrote a Constitution, and Washington took that thing and he gave it out to all the delegates who are coming to make the American Constitution, and he said, this is what we ought to go by. Steeped in religious material, absolutely steeped in religion. So we brought up George Washington. Let's take a look at him. I like this a lot better than some of those pictures of him where his face looks kind of puffy and all. This is a nice
chiseled look.
Chiseled look, yeah. Well, that's about the average size of a person. So I mean, it's just huge. So was he a deist? I guess the question would be, so what does it mean to be a deist? Well, during this time period, deism was coming on as kind of a rational replacement for Christianity. It was sort of a dry religion. It said there was a God. Yeah, there's a God. But he doesn't interfere with anything. He started the world, thanks to Newton, as he began to figure out how planets go around and gravity and all that kind of stuff. They started thinking of the whole universe as a clock with pieces, and everything meshes and everything works just nice. It's a very mechanical universe. And so the idea was, well, maybe there's a God, okay. But all he did was kind of wind that clock up, and then he set it down, and then he doesn't interfere. He doesn't get involved. Don't pray to him. He doesn't do miracles. He's off somewhere else. And you're kind of on your own. Make your life as good as you can. Be a nice person. That kind of thing. That's deism. So, the secular comment these days is, well, he was probably just a deist. He just kind of gave lip service to God. Oh, really? He grew up going to church, and these are the kinds of churches. Every Sunday they would do the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, 10 Commandments. Everybody recited these things. Now, does that mean it affected his heart? No, but he's steeped in it. He was a vestryman in his church. That meant he was kind of like an elder. They would hire and fire pastors, and they would make sure the economics of the church functioned, and a week-to-week kind of thing. So, I mean, that's more than just sitting in the back pew someplace. This guy was really involved in his churches. He made a big deal about chaplains in the military. Now, did he have to do that? No. Why would you do that if you didn't have any interest in Christianity? After Valley Forge, you recognize the term there, Valley Forge, he wrote this to his troops. To the distinguished character of a patriot, it ought to be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of a Christian. He didn't have to write these things. Nobody is making a big deal about it. It's not like a talk trying to get elected or anything. He's already the general of the troops there. And yet he says something like this. It's great. I'm glad you're patriots. You showed up. You stuck it out here at Valley Forge. But better than that would be to be a Christian. Gary?
What a famous picture of him.
Kneeling?
Kneeling in the snow.
Yeah, kneeling in the snow.
Which he did not do in front of anybody. Someone just came along and saw it.
Yeah.
And that story was told.
Yeah. I've got more about Washington as well. One time, a group of Indians sent I think it was a written message to him, just asking, what the government could do for them. Now he said this: "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention." Now, do you hear church and state mixing there? He spoke of providence. Somebody went through his talks. He spoke of providence again and again and again. That was his term, and a lot of the terms that they would use back then for God. That he was active in world affairs, especially the revolution. If we have time today, I want to tell you a really fascinating story of what happened during the war. One obvious episode of the hand of God involved in helping the Americans survive. God's help, he says, to the American cause was so conspicuous that one must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligation. So he saw it firsthand. He said God was there. His hand was on these things that happened. Finally, on his tomb is a reference to John 11. I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. Again, these are things that don't have to have been there. They don't have to have been things he said and did, but very connected with the Christian faith. Let's move along to the Founding Fathers. He would be one, of course, but I wanted to do Washington separately. So were they deists? Well, the famous ones, 2 or 3 of them, yes. And there they are up there, and that's about it, out of the Founding Fathers. Now, when you see that term capitalized, Founding Fathers, it's an actual proper list of about 55 or 56, I've forgotten how many, 56. 56 people that started the country that were involved either with the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. They're called the Founding Fathers. Yes, a small percent. Jefferson, in fact, I don't know if you heard this story, but he was a deist to the point he didn't really believe in miracles. So he took the Bible, the New Testament, and I guess he physically cut out anything that references Jesus walking on water, clip, clip, clip. Jesus is turning water into wine, clip, clip, clip. That went out. And what was left, it was called the Jefferson Bible. I don't know, maybe you can still buy a copy today. So basically, Jesus is a nice guy that goes around saying, be nice to people and turn the other cheek. And then he gets up on a cross and gets put to death. Isn't that a shame? What a message. I mean, that doesn't give you much faith. Franklin, probably pretty secular. Sometimes in college classes we'll read his autobiography. By the way, it's a very readable book. If you have a chance, I don't know if you had to read it way back in school, but the autobiography, he just sounds like a neat guy to get to know. But he said, well, you know what you ought to do to have a good life is imitate Socrates and Jesus. But he put them on the same level. Socrates was wise, Jesus was wise, they're both guys, just try to live like them, really. And then Paine, some people called him that dirty atheist. They didn't like him very much, but he was a big hero during the Revolution as later, where more of his, I wouldn't call it anti-Christian, but pretty cynical, skeptical comments started coming out. He's the one that wrote These Are the Times That Try Men's Souls, and it was a book that came out during the Revolutionary War. But look at the rest of these people. Out of these 50-some founding fathers, almost half of them held offices in Bible societies. They didn't just sign up and say, yeah, call me part of your board. I mean, they were officials. And can you imagine, these are pretty serious Bible societies in those days. These are not liberal organizations at all. They held offices. The first session of the Continental Congress, now that's before the Revolution, opened with a 3-hour prayer and Bible study. 3 hours. Out of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, almost half again had seminary degrees. And again, these are not liberal schools where you can study God but not believe in God. These are serious schools that were Christian schools at the time. Almost half had seminary degrees, not just a class here, a class there. The Treaty of Paris, that's at the end of the war with Britain, includes these words, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity, amen. The Trinity shows up in the Peace Treaty. Again, not necessary unless you really thought it was important to be a Christian. How about some more about the Founding Fathers? The American Tract Society, help me out on this, I think they're still around. Isn't that correct? So they've been around 200 plus years. Many of the early authors who wrote the tracts were Founding Fathers. Again, they're putting more on the line than they had to unless they really thought Christianity was important. John Jay, he wrote part of the Federalist Papers to try to convince people to vote for the Constitution. He was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Can you imagine that? Pretty high honor, pretty well-known individual. He said this, Providence, that's God again, has given to our people a choice of their rulers, democracy, and it's the duty of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for the ruler. Wouldn't that go over big today? Doesn't sound like a secular nation to me. Do you hear separation of church and state? No, he says we ought to have Christians involved. They ought to be there. They ought to be in charge of things. In the 1770s, the Founding Fathers, they've gone through all the things that they talked about. What did they quote? Mostly from the Bible. Not Locke. Yeah, they quoted Locke and some others, but it was the Bible. After Washington was inaugurated, the whole Congress went to a church service together. Not a few. The whole church full of Christians who are part of the government. I don't hear separation of church and state from that. But Thomas Jefferson is the one people love to play with, right? That's the big guy that people will lay out there. Yeah, but Jefferson wasn't much of a believer. Yeah, he was just a deist. Oh, he was a cynic. Really? He advocated Bibles to be given to areas called the Northwest Territories that were just beginning to be opened up to exploration, where Ohio is and Indiana and places like that. And this is while he's president. He advocates Bibles be given out to the people there. That sounds like church and state together. He attended church services, had the Marine Band playing at worship services. He urged local governments make land available for churches for Christian purposes. He used federal funds for Christian missionaries and erecting a church there. Wow. You don't hear this kind of stuff, though, do you, these days? What do you say about Christianity? Oh, I like this one a lot. No nation has ever existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that's been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example. Let me just ask you something here. What happens if you don't have a religious underpinning to a people that are allowed to govern themselves? Is that a problem?
The French Revolution.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. Yeah, if you don't have a moral foundation, you do whatever you want. And if you do whatever you want, we all have bad hearts. We're going to do some pretty bad things. So what do you end up doing? Having to put a heavy hand on the people to keep them down. And so if you're running a communist state or something, yeah, you can just use the heavy hand of the state to run things. But if you really expect people to run their lives in a civil body politic to all come together, you better have some self-restraints. And how do you get self-restraints? Christian morality. So he says you can't really run a country without religion. And look what's happening today. This is what makes me so nervous about the country today. People are not just giving a lip service, they're saying we're better off to separate. Are you kidding me? Look what Jefferson said. He's your hero, but if you don't like Christianity, you go to Jefferson. But look what he had to say. You can't have a country without some sort of moral, religious basis. You get chaos. I mean, we're starting to see it in the streets right now. People are refusing to come together as a nation. And we talked about that last week. It makes me very nervous to see that kind of thing. And pretty soon, it's got to be more cameras on street corners. It's going to be more invasion of privacy. It's going to be more police on the streets. It's going to be more and more of this, I don't want to call it police state, but I just think we're heading for more and more outward pressure on us to obey because we can't do it ourselves once you cut the ties from religion. There's no morality there anymore. People don't function very well without that. But what about that wall of separation? People love to talk about that wall of separation that Jefferson was talking about. Well, let's give the background to this thing. It was a small church called the Danbury Church, and they sent Jefferson a letter. So it's not an official thing. This is not like in Congress they're debating it or anything like that. It was just a private letter to Jefferson saying, hey, we're a little concerned about what we're going to be undergoing as a small religious group. Jefferson, by the way, was not even in the U.S. when that First Amendment talking about freedom of religion was being debated. He was not there. He was a minister to France. He was our French ambassador at the time. So he was not here. He didn't really know the background of the... So right off, he's not the expert to go to. If you want to say, what did the First Amendment mean? Go to Madison. Go to some of these other people. Don't go to Jefferson. What did he say in the letter? He said, we want a wall to protect religious activities from the government. So the wall is, in a sense, the wall's around Washington. The wall isn't around our church that we can't say something outside the church. So it was exact opposite wall. He says we got to protect the citizens as they want to express themselves from infringement coming from a federal government. And for over 100 years, that phrase, separate, because it's in that letter, the separation of church and state, that wall of separation. For over 100 years, the Supreme Court and national organizations always interpreted it as don't set up a national church that everybody has to attend and you snuff out all these smaller churches. So you don't want to have a national Episcopal church. You don't want to have a national Baptist church. Don't do that. People had seen what that was like over in European countries. And it did not encourage church attendance, did it? I mean, it ended up whoever your ruler was, that was the religion for a while, and then that ruler died, maybe somebody else came along. All of a sudden the religion changes, and now you thought you're okay before, and then it's just all ritualistic anyway, and people just blew that off as useless. So they said, let's not do that. We don't want to have a single national denomination, Catholic or Protestant or whatever. Let the best man win, in a sense, just like economics. Let them go out and work with their own group of people here. It wasn't until, now we're in about, the 70th year of this. 1947 was the first time the Supreme Court said, no, separation of church and state. That the church can't influence the state. It should not be connected in any way with the state, which is not what they were talking about at all. So we've lived under this for a pretty short period of time when you consider the whole history of the United States.
Gary, do you know who the Chief Justice was?
In 47? Earl Warren was the 50s, but it was probably pre-Earl Warren because he got appointed by Eisenhower. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the vote was either. I don't know if it was a close vote or a real lopsided vote, but we're living in a post-Christian nation, and we're seeing more and more of these decisions coming from the Supreme Court that seem really strange from our whole country's history. So what did the founders believe about religion and government? Well, they were not opposed to having a religion connect to the government. You've already seen some of the quotations about that. Washington declared a day of prayer and thanksgiving when the Constitution was amended and ratified. Madison, what about Madison? Let's get off Washington for a minute. Madison declared a day of prayer to God and fasting. He said, before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. There we are again. You want to be in a civil, I think that can mean several things, right? It means people coming together, but it can also mean civil, getting along well. He said, how can you be a member of a civil society, especially with the responsibilities of making choices of your leaders, and for heaven's sakes, you get to vote yourself money. Taxes and that kind of stuff. And do we have the kind of moral fiber to be able to not just give ourselves things until we run out of money? He was saying the only way you can be a member of that kind of society, realize you're not in charge. There's a person over you, the governor of the universe. I think that was an interesting choice of words, governor. Individual states had established churches. So what's the big deal? There was no intention by the founders to get rid of God and state. If they thought they wanted to get rid of God, they would have gone after those individual churches. But they said, no, that's fine. So the churches had official state religions. They were just saying, we don't want the federal government to set up a state religion that everybody in the whole U.S. has to follow. The framers of the First Amendment declared a national day of thanksgiving to God after they ratified the First Amendment. These are secular people who have no problem bringing in God and having days of prayer and thanksgiving. I like this quote from John Adams. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Do you hear how many times that keeps coming up? If you're not a religious people, if you cut your ties from religion, what do you end up with? Not a democracy anymore. And if it is, it's going to be a very heavy-handed one that is just a democracy in name. It's going to be a sham. It's going to be whoever's in power has to push down hard on the people, or it'll be utter chaos. The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. This is still Adams. I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as internal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. There's Christianity, not just God talk, but there's Christianity talk. And he says, here's the guy that knows. He was back there doing all the stuff from the Boston Massacre on. He was involved. In fact, he got a terrific job. He got to be the defender of the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre. How popular would that have been? Not very popular. So he saw the thing begin to develop. He was there for those early constitutional meetings. He was there all the way through. And later in his life, he said this, the general principles were the principles of Christianity. That's how our government got started. That was the foundation of America. And he said those principles are eternal and immutable. They don't go away. They don't change with the times. They don't change with a change of parties in power. What's that? A living constitution. Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. Eternal and immutable. A little bit opposite. So let's take it one step further. So let's say we buy into the fact, okay, these people were probably more Christian than the way secular people were telling us today. But what did that do for the country to have that kind of foundation? Well, Gary brought up a while back the French Revolution. Why did you bring that up? Let's talk about that for a second. Because you have two revolutions happening pretty closely together as far as time goes. French Revolution was 10 years or so later. What's the difference, Gary?
Totally devoid of morality.
Oh, yeah. And you end up with a guillotine, and it's like every day it's another group of people. Robespierre, the one that got the whole thing rolling, he ended up being chopped. So utter ironies put to death. And what happened after the French Revolution? Napoleon. You don't get democracy, you get another dictator. And he took his people through blood and slaughter for years and years and years. It took the whole continent to finally land on him and put that down. But for what, 30, 40 years, France was a mess. The French Revolution was an immoral revolution. There was no Christian foundation to that at all, compared to the American one.
The big thing in the news now is how the French establishment, the legal establishment, has for years apparently hired their families when their families don't do anything. It's just essentially they just pull in lots more money into their own pockets.
Yeah.
And I guess the French are finally getting tired of it.
Yeah. how about the fact that because it was a Christian background, there was a suspicion of the human nature, that everybody was sinful. And so you don't set up a utopian kind of thing where everybody joins hands and sings Kumbaya and we have this wonderful, peaceful thing. They said, no, we don't trust people in power. So what do? They give a little power here, and they give a little power here, and they give a little power here, and then let them clash. And because we're all selfish, they're going to argue with each other. That's good. You don't consolidate power. And so no wonder the Congress is always griping at the President is always griping at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's putting down laws that Congress made. It was set up that way. I always love it when I hear people say, oh, the country's dysfunctional, the government's dysfunctional. I'm thinking, yeah, that's the way they wanted it. Somebody once said, be grateful you're not getting all the government you pay for. I mean, if they all work together, somebody said one of the worst things that happened to Washington, D.C. is they brought air conditioning in so those people could meet year-round and pass laws. Before they used to leave Washington. It was terrible in the summer. Now it's not bad. We've got air conditioning. Let's pass some more laws. Oh, really? So the separation of church and state, the separation here of the powers was terrific. That's a very good thing. But it's based on Christianity, where we're a little suspicious of the human race. It encouraged the value of the individual. America, because of Christianity, has really emphasized the individual. It upheld the equality of all people. Remember when Paul's talking about there's neither Jew nor Greek and male nor female and slave? I mean, there's real oneness of the human race. And we've seen that for over 200 years. Everybody wants to come here. It's called the melting pot. You can be as much an American as somebody who's been here for 5 generations if you've just come over, because we believe in the equality of everybody. The laws, keep this in mind, all laws reflect somebody's morality. I always like that. People say you can't legislate morality. I'm thinking, what other kind of law is there? All laws legislate somebody's morality. Speed limit, drug usage, whatever it is. It's all morality. So, good thing, U.S. laws, at least in the past, reflected Christian morality, which is a high moral level, isn't it? The vast majority of the greatest reformers that we had, Martin Luther King, the people from the 1800s and all, they were motivated by Christian faith. So I think these are at least some of the things that we can be grateful for coming from the background of the Christianity. I got a lot of this from Wall Builders. Some of you are familiar with Wall Builders. They have DVDs. A guy named David Barton puts out a lot of material. He's fascinating. Kennedy, this is D. James Kennedy, passed away a while back. I think this DVD is probably still available. One Nation Under God. Again, I got a lot of material from that. Another one, Christianity on Trial. And then, if that's okay, can we go 5 more minutes, or do we have... Is that all right? Okay, a lot of ruffling out there. But I want to focus on this. Michael Medved, do you like him, or you hear him? He's a radio talk show host in the afternoons. He puts out... He's a Jew, but he's got all sorts of wonderful books about... He's very pro-Christian, and he's very pro-America. He's got a new book out called The American Miracle, and I want to give you 2 quick stories from that. Another one is called Miracles of the American Revolution, because, again, I want to emphasize God's hand was on this country from the founders on up. So let's do this. 2 quick stories from Medved. He said there was a French and Indian War before the American Revolution. You probably heard about that one. The British and the French were both in North America. No, there's not enough room for both. And so this big clash was going on. And in one of the episodes, 1755, there's a Fort Duquesne that's run by the French, and the British want to take it out. And this is where Pittsburgh is today. I think they still have the outline. I don't think it's the original fort, but you can, if you've been in Pittsburgh, you can go there. So there's this Fort Duquesne, and a guy named Braddock is the British general. So he gets about 1,000 troops together, and Washington's already been out and done things in the field against the French. So he says, the British don't really like the Americans, particularly. They think they're kind of ignoramuses, but they said, okay, let's have Washington be one of our staff guys. So Washington comes on board. They have Indians, they have mostly British, and they go marching out, and they go up there toward Fort Duquesne. But you know how the British fought? They're stupid. They're all, in their rows, and they're bright red. It might as well paint a target. It's like... So they're marching along there, and the Indian allies and Washington are saying, don't do this. Scatter into the bushes a little bit. This is a perfect spot for an ambush because you got the forest on each side. No. And so Braddock, we're British, we can take care of anything. And they're marching along there, and then they get ambushed. And I kind of like this image because it's a little dark and hard to see, but these are supposed to be the French and Indian allies down here, taking out the British up at the top in the red there. And they did. It was just a mass slaughter. And Braddock got killed. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. He had 4 bullet holes in his clothes, but not one bullet hit him. And later, so you think, well, just kind of a lucky guy. So about 15 years later, he was in the woods area someplace, and there was some old Indian guy that wanted to meet him. And so they met. And this Indian says, I was one of the leaders that day during this fight. And he said, I told my men, his fellow Indians, he said, see that guy over there, he's in charge of something. He said, we got to take him out. And he said, our guys unloaded on him. And he said, they unloaded on him and unloaded on him. And he said, finally, don't waste any more bullets. The Great Spirit's protecting him. So he came up to Washington and he said, I just know you have great things in front of you because the Great Spirit sees you as a powerful individual. So, that's more than just lucky shots that never got to hit home. But, so there's one story. The other one that is during the war itself, oh, sorry, it's a little faint here, so you probably can't see it very well. After the war starts in 1776 in Boston, that's where the British are. So Washington is first given the generalship, and he comes down, and they choke off Boston, so the British leave. And so the Americans go, yay, the British are gone. And Washington says, they're not gone. They're just temporarily reassembling. They're coming back. So the best guess, and they guessed right, was New York would be attacked because the British could come up in New York, split off the northeast colonies versus the southern colonies. And New York was a big city at the time. So Washington brings his army out. I wish you could see it better. This is Long Island here. There's the East River here, and there's Manhattan up here, and this is the Hudson. So Washington comes to Long Island. You going to try something there? Oh, does that help at all? Okay, I got to get a better map sometime. So Washington is on Long Island, this big island that moves up like this. The British come and they do a sneaky thing. See the red arrow here? He didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. There's this little used path, and somebody spilled beans, and so a lot of the British troops came around here and they smashed the American army. The American army went back as far as they could to the edge of Long Island. Now they're just hanging by their fingernails. But luckily, Howe, who's the British general, takes his time. He's not in any big fat hurry. In fact, he kind of sympathized with the Americans, but he sat there and kind of dug in and kind of straightened things up. So the night came, and Washington's got to get his troops out of there because in the morning, what's going to happen? The British, do you see the little ship signals here? The British are going to bring their fleet around the edge of the East River and choke off Washington. He's not going to be allowed to escape. Even if he had boats, he won't be able to escape because the British fleet is going to be there. Big gun ships. Well, a strange wind came up that never comes up and doesn't blow the way it was blowing, and it blew this way, and it kept the ships from coming in and blocking Washington's escape route. So that's item number one. Nobody had ever seen a wind like this. Very odd. Secondly, Washington then was able to gather some boats. And they're small boats, and they're trying to shuttle back and forth in the middle of the night, hoping the British don't hear them, so they're muffling the oars and trying to be real quiet. They're trying to get these guys off of Long Island, get them up to Manhattan here, so that there'll be water in between him and the British, and they'll be okay. But daylight comes, and they haven't gotten the troops all the way across. They've got about a half of them, and they still have thousands of these poor guys stuck there. And once the sun comes out and the British see what's going on, the British come and they'll just destroy what's left of the army and probably end the war. And at that moment, when the sun's about ready to come up, a huge fog bank comes in. Again, something so weird. Everybody commented on it. Anybody that wrote, like diaries and stuff, they all commented. They said, that's weird. And it was so thick, you couldn't see anything. So Washington's guys keep rowing. They get across. The fog goes away. Wow. And the British guys are looking out there going, where'd they go? And so even the British people said that was the oddest thing in the world. And do you know who David McCullough is? He's a writer, excellent historian. And he said, for a lot of people, he wouldn't commit himself, but he said for a lot of people, they saw it as God's hand. And I think so too. So that's just some of the things, and Medved does other things and talks about other events of the war and since then. But I just find that really fascinating.